What is involved in the process of knife making? What are the best types of steel? And what are the real costs involved? If you'd like to find out, then you're in the right place. Welcome to Between Views. I'm your host, Alec Koski. This podcast aims to cast light on and connect you with inspirational people, identify them as potential mentors in your journey, and share their stories and wisdom with the world. In this episode, we converse with Nexus Lurie about the process of knife making, the best grades of steel, and the real costs involved in starting up. And just before we begin, for our South African listeners, we have a giveaway for you. Between Views has worked closely with Knives by Nexus to offer your choice of one of 3 hand-forged steak knives. All you need to do to enter is follow both Between Views and Knives by Nexus on Instagram and like and share our collaborative post to your story. The winner will be drawn September 26th. Good luck.
You are using steel that's not stainless steel, so you need to polish it and finish it off. Does that mean that the knives you make will need some care along the way?
Yeah. So to give you a clear-cut answer on the last question, most of the knives I make, I seal them with beeswax after polishing, and I polish it with the beeswax. They'll be good to use in the kitchen, and they won't rust. But if you don't take care of them, and if you wash them with hot water, you're going to wash off that protective layer, that coating of beeswax or whatever polish has been used. Then you're letting that steel get exposed to oxygen and water.
Oxidize.
And then it could rust.
Also, I remember I cut something with, I think it was this zucchini with a knife once that wasn't stainless steel, and it just rusted instantly. But you gave me some advice, which was what?
So certain fruits, vegetables, zucchinis, tomatoes, onions, pineapples, citrus in general, they're very acidic. And if you're using steel that isn't stainless steel, acids work, they erode steel. So you'll notice almost instantly if you leave that acidic solution, the juice from the tomato or the zucchini, on that steel for, I wouldn't say a couple seconds, but a minute or 2 or more. Some people have what I call poor knife use skills in the kitchen, where they'll often use a knife and they'll leave it with bits and things on it instead of wiping it down.
You should wipe it straight away, right? Good knife practice, as far as I understand, is to use it, and then as soon as you're done, quick wash and wipe.
Yeah.
And then put it away.
If you look at any chef, if you look at any person who works with food, knives are their tools. They're their instruments. You cut, you dice, you slice. As soon as you're done cutting, you clean the knife. Often it's a wet, cold rag. Something that's not hot, that won't wipe off that protective coating. And you make sure that you wipe it down clean, dry it, put it down. Proceed with whatever you're doing with the food. That's good knife practice. So that is kind of what you need to do if you're working with a high carbon steel knife, as opposed to stainless steel, which are most kitchen knives that you buy. General kitchen knives that you buy in shops will be of a relatively mid-grade stainless steel. It holds a decent edge for a little while, and you don't have to worry about washing after every time you slice a tomato.
What's the best type of steel?
There really isn't a best type of steel.
What's your dream steel?
There is this, there's this stuff in Japan, which it's just regarded as like a Japanese super stainless. And I don't know the exact name. They have like a G10 or whatever it is, or V3 steel or something. It's a Japanese stainless steel that they've worked and developed on for, I'd like to say 100,000 years, hundreds years. But it's a stainless steel that has a 1.1% carbon content in it.
Okay.
So it's extremely hard. It has brilliant edge retention, but it's also stainless, so it doesn't erode so easily. And that's kind of the dream steel to get to work with as a knife maker.
Nice.
But it's very expensive.
Of course. Well, if Knives by Nexus continues growing the way it is, perhaps one day we'll get there. Before we move on to the next question, can you give me a very quick dot point of knife making from top to bottom? Just dot points.
Yeah, sure. So, find a piece of steel. Make sure you have certain tools that you're going to need, i.e. a file, either a hacksaw, which is manually cutting, or a baby grinder. It's the basics, really. You need to shape the steel, either through cutting it or forging to shape. Once you've shaped your steel, you need to grind and bevel it. Grinding, beveling, making the edge. Once you have an edge, you put your attention on the tang, which is the point where the handle goes on. Once you've worked out the tang, or what you're going to do, be it full tang, hidden tang, or through tang, you're then going to go back to your edge of the blade and you're going to polish it, sharpen it, make sure that it's done and ready. You're going to wrap that up with some tape or some protective layer, and then you're going to work on the handle. Figure out what you want for your handle, what kind of wood, plastic, whatever you're going to use. If you're doing a full tang handle, you need to make some pivot holes, rivet holes, for points of attachment for your epoxy or your adhesive that you're going to use, and to put a couple pins through to stick the pieces together and make sure that it's all holding nice and keeping tension. At the end of it all, another sharpen on the blade and a bit of a polish and a cleanup.
Okay.
Roughly basic how to make a knife.
Nice. And then you got to take it down the shop.
Yeah.
If you're selling them, of course. Cool. Thank you for that. I guess the next part is, what would someone need to start up, and how much would a good setup cost?
Wow.
Let's say you did just have a bunch of cash.
Yeah. So let's say
and you were just like, I'm just going to try knife making now.
Yeah.
You got the money, you're ready to go, and you could just buy in at good quality instruments. What would you go for, and how much?
Okay, so that brings up a few different points here. Now, I focus on a more traditional aspect of knife making and forging, and I focus on using a charcoal forge, which is more traditional. If you're looking at a more efficient setup, typically people go for a gas forge. Gas forges it's a combination of using propane and oxygen to burn. And you can get really high temperatures really quickly, open up your gases, make sure your mixture's right, light it up, poof, you got your heat, plonk your piece of steel in there, you're good to go. What do you need if, let's say, you don't have a limited budget? You're going to need, first of all, a workspace. Typically a space that's got good ventilation, so when you have your forge burning, you have airflow around you, because it is incredibly hot standing in front of a fire that reaches over 1,000 degrees Celsius. I'm not too sure what that is in Fahrenheit. Workspace. You then need a series of hammers. One hammer is fine, but really you need about 3 or 4. Each hammer has a different role, a different use, a different shape, a different face. And that all comes into play with your forging. I typically like having my big square hammer, both ends are square, and it's about 2 kilos, which is about a 4.4 pounder. That is what I use for mass moving, when the steel's hot, moving steel quickly into a rough shape. Then it's about an 800 gram, close to about 2 pound ball peen hammer, which means the one end is round, as in almost spherical round, and the other head is just round circle but flat.
Okay.
Peening is good for pushing out the steel, and then flattening and working light taps and strokes. A cross peen hammer is very important, meaning that it's quite wide and it's a sort of triangular head of a hammer with a nice rounded end of the top of the triangle, and you use that to spread the steel. Makes moving steel a lot easier than just a flat face. You then need an anvil, or a block of steel that is flat and is a big enough surface area for you to work your hot piece of steel on, moving and shaping your knife. That obviously needs to go into something, an anvil stand, a big log, whatever works. So those are the basics. A forge. If you're going to build your own forge, or if you're going to buy one, if it's more efficient and easier for you to do that, a gas propane forge setup is around, down here right now, it's about 12 to 15,000 Rand for the full setup, which
what's that in US dollars?
It's almost 1,000 US.
Okay.
It's about 850 roughly, if I can think of it that way. About 850 US dollars for the forge with the tanks. If you're looking at an anvil, a new anvil, you don't go for cast iron. Iron anvils are often used for engineering purposes, where they're working with whole different kinds of steels and materials, and those anvils aren't getting repeatedly smashed with a steel hammer.
Yeah, of course.
You need a cast steel or a forged steel anvil. The base of it can be iron, but the plate on the top needs to be about an inch thick at least of steel, hardened steel, because that's taking a lot of impact. A good quality anvil, you're looking at anything of 20 kilograms to about 50 kilograms, which is great. Anything over that would be nice, but is overkill. You're looking at about brand new $200 to about $1,200, depending on the size of the anvil and the quality. Hammers are relatively cheap. You can get good quality hammers.
Wait, so the anvil costs more than the forge?
A good quality 50 to 60 kilogram forged steel anvil will cost you more than the forge will, because it's a big heavy chunk of something.
Yeah.
And getting it to wherever you need to get it to is going to cost you as well. From there, you have your workshop space, you have your forge built now, you have a set of hammers. Hammers, if you 4 or 5 hammers will cost you about $100 USD. Or less if you go pick them up at the right places. But if you're kind of just buying everything you want online in one big shopping basket and waiting for it to be delivered to your house, you're going to be spending about $100 to $150 US dollars.
Okay.
Anvil up to about over $1,000. Your forge will be close to $1,000. Then you need something to work your steel once you forged it. Typically, the best tool are belt grinders, belt machines that are designed for grinding steel. You get belt sanders, which are used all over for carpentry businesses. They're designed to spin at higher revolutions, which work well for wood. However, steel typically is best off at slower revolutions. So right now, the dream belt sander that I want to buy, or belt grinder, it's a 50 mil or 2 inch by 72 inches, or in metric, that is 50 mils by 2000. So it's a 50 by 2 meter belt.
Sure.
And it's a machine that allows variable speeds. It's a variable speed motor. You will have several different belt grits that you will use, the roughest being 36 grit, working to 60, 80, 100, 120, 220, 320 if you're lucky to find those, 400, 600, 800, and then your polishing belts are grains above that.
Yeah, sure.
Roughly the cost of those belts will be in the range of, depending on your supplier, $5 to $10 each. The machine itself, as is plain, is about 12,000 Rand, which is about $650. But if you want to have a few nice attachments to it, different size wheels on the ends for different diameters to grind, something called a surface grinding jig, which is an attachment that is a nice flat surface that you can put your blade on, your piece of steel, and grind so that it gives a perfectly flat surface on that blade. All these extra little attachments, you're looking at close to $1,000 all in all for the grinding machine. So add that to your anvil, add that to your hammers, add that to your forge.
Okay, so we're currently sitting at about 3,000-ish US, even the touch more.
Yeah, about $3,000 basic with a few little add-ons here and there.
Okay.
And then you need to look at steel, the important part. If you're buying steel and you're buying clean steel, you're looking at getting stuff like 80 CRV2, 5160, 1080, 1070, 1095 steel, or you're going into your sort of high carbon stainless steels, your German Böhler steel, your N690 steel. And
how much does a bit of steel for a knife cost if you bought enough just to make one standard kitchen knife?
So that's relative to where you are. Down here, as is now, I buy steel from the supplier that I buy my supplies from. I get a piece of steel that is often, it's 1 meter by, so a meter is about 3 feet by 50 mils, 2 inches wide, and the thickness of the steel is about 3 millimeters, or I don't know what that is in an inch. I think an eighth of an inch, maybe. About an eighth of an inch. That piece of steel, as is alone, of 80 CRV2, which is a high carbon steel, which is also really tough. It's great for making knives, bigger knives as well, machetes, things like that. I pay about 300 Rand for, which is the equivalent of about 15 USD.
Okay.
So steel is relatively inexpensive compared to your other things, but it's what you're using a lot of.
Sure.
It's you're buying plenty of steel as well. Other steels do cost more. However, the same piece of 1095 steel, 1095 means that it's 0.95% carbon, so it's almost 1% carbon.
Getting pretty close to what you want.
Will roughly cost more or less the same,
Yeah.
about 15 to 20 USD for a 3-foot piece by 2 inches and an eighth thick. So,
okay.
yeah, and then you've got to look at your handle material, what you want to use for handles. If you're going into the sort of, I don't know, the slightly fancier realm of knife handles, you're looking at buying bone, you're looking at buying rare woods, or you're looking at using rare materials like gold, silver, inlays, things like that. It's hard to say. Pricing range, it's all over.
True, it's kind of all over with that one.
Depends on what you get.
The handle's somewhat artistic piece,
Yeah.
and you can add as you please to it,
Yeah.
right? Because you're sort of getting more into woodworking in a way there as well.
Yeah.
Nice. Well, with all that in mind, that's what someone might need to start up. Of course, though, people who are just beginning, they could just sort of take a similar path to what you have. Speaking of steel and materials that you could turn into knives, I noticed that you have used loads of just different leftover things, from garden tools to leftover blades from things already, just sort of reforging them. What are some things people could find around their house if they wanted to just start forging up? Like if they had made a basic forge and wanted to get to it, but they sort of didn't want to buy steel, what are some things people could just muck around with for practice?
Yeah, so the three sort of easy things to look for, we're in a day and age where there's, people are buying new cars all the time. Scrapyards are full of old cars. Old leaf springs, the suspension from a lot of old cars, is brilliant steel. It's known as 5160 steel. It's 0.6% carbon. That 5.1 has to do with I think it's the molybdenum and chromium content, which helps give it the toughness. But yeah, so spring steel, it's a spring steel, that's what it's called, is pretty easy to find. But if you don't happen to have a old car lying around or not near some of that, the next best thing is old garden tools. Not spades, but garden shears. Typically old tool steel will be made out of relatively high carbon because they're designed to hold an edge for a long time without being, sharpened and stuff regularly. So that's always a good bet. Another thing is, like I mentioned earlier, lawnmower blades. Old school lawnmower blades, ones that just use the one long blade that doesn't have the four edges, the corners. Those are typically a high carbon steel, and those are quite thin, so it's quite easy to work those.
Sure.
So that's kind of the first start of finding easy steel around. But if you really want to just try something and get into it, take an old kitchen knife that's looking a bit rusty and a bit dull, and break the handle off of that and reshape it.
Nice. And I guess so we've talked about how someone could start. If someone had a bunch of cash and wanted to begin, you told them what they could go and find and purchase. What about for you though? Let's say that you had an unlimited resources right now. What would be your dream setup? If you could just full blown make your dream knife making area, how does that look?
Yeah, right. Okay, so like I said earlier, I work with a charcoal forge. I prefer the traditional aspect of forging in that sense. What I would like is, if I had a nice big brilliant workshop with a very nice flat clean screed concrete floor that was level, I would then in the one corner still stick with charcoal forge. I would buy a gas forge secondary as well. They both have different uses that are great. Dream setup is have the big charcoal forge with a big flue hood above it for air ventilation, hood heading out of the ceiling, so you still have good clean air ventilation and you're not losing a lot of heat. This is something that some people don't really think about when they're building their first forges outside, is how much heat you're actually losing.
Just from being in the elements.
Just from being in the elements. How much airflow there is above the heat of the forge, what's going on around there. You lose heat, how efficient your forge actually is, and how you're powering it. Are you using manual or automatic airflow? Automatic airflow for a charcoal forge is not really the best idea. So I have a box bellow that I've built. It's an old Chinese design, and I think I would stay with that. I would make a new one, slightly bigger, better wood, make it a lot more airtight, and I would still stick with the traditional build that I use, but I would make it a little bit more sort of just bigger and more well done, as it were.
Okay.
So that's the forge aspect of it. A nice thing to have, which I think is rather underrated, is a rack for your hammers. Having your hammers at a level height that you don't have to bend down to pick them up or have them too high is also something people don't think about. When you're spending 5-6 hours a day swinging a hammer, it's nice to have it at an easy to reach place. So a nice rack for my hammers is a good thing. Something like just a few pieces of steel that are welded together with a nice strip of 2 bars and a nice gap where the hammers just slide in. You can pick up and go and grab. As I mentioned, I would have a gas forge. Gas forges are really nice for when you're trying to do layered steel, Damascus steel, things like that, because it's just clean and easy and neat. You can watch your piece of steel, see when it's at its correct temperature. Charcoal forges, your piece of steel is hidden in the charcoal, so you have to have a lot more intuition and a bit more experience working with charcoal to understand when your steel's reached its critical temperature. So a gas forge is good, and it's sometimes also, you don't want to light up the charcoal forge and stand there pumping a bellow. So
yeah, of course.
It's nice to just turn the propane on and let it burn and watch your piece of steel heat up, and while you're doing that, you can go get a bunch of other things done. So there's that aspect.
So it sort of allows you to work a bit more hands-free, and it's less laborious.
Yes, yeah, definitely less labor intensive. And like I mentioned, there's a very nice grinder that I've got my eyes on. It's made by Herbst, and it's a 2x72 inch or metric 50 mils by 2000 big bulk grinder setup with multiple different wheel attachments which give you different diameters for grinding, a flat bar for doing flat grinds, a surface grinder for cleaning the surface of your steel to make sure you've got even flat edges, combined with a variable speed motor and a range of belts. That is really the prize, because currently I use it's called a baby belt grinder. It's a 1 inch by 36 inches maybe, I don't know what the length of the belt is. In metric it's 25 by 762, and it does the job, but it does mean I have a very limited amount of surface area that's grinding at one time. So by doubling your surface area, you're actually increasing your work productivity four times.
Sure.
So there's that aspect.
So by the sounds of it, it's about making the process a little faster and a bit more hands-free, so that you can sort of focus on the more creative aspects of knife making and maybe perhaps pump out more blades over less time.
Yeah, like it doesn't take away the hands-on aspect. It just means that you're moving more material faster.
Okay.
And when you're working with a wider belt, you've got a wider surface area being sanded, ground down at once. You're moving more material at once, and it's easier to keep a set angle when you have a wider plate that you're pushing your steel against. When you have a narrower plate, if you're doing hand grinding, which I do, I don't really use jigs often, there's always going to be slight deviation in the angle that you're holding at. And that is going to be more noticeable when you have a narrower surface area you're pushing against than a wider one. So there's that aspect. But yes, when the process of forming, forging, shaping, and grinding is a bit more quicker and easier and efficient, it definitely allows me to have more time and inclination for the more creative aspect and what I'm going to do after that. So after getting a very nice grinder, the next thing is getting a really nice anvil. A really nice anvil makes a huge difference, and not just one, but 2 or 3. Different sizes, different shapes. The dream would be about a 75 or even 100 kilo steel anvil that has 2 hardy holes in, one square, one round, and of course a beautiful nice horn with a good 1 inch on the step on the anvil. The step is where you have the base flat plate of the anvil, and you have a little bit of a step down to where the next block is, where the horn starts to stick out.
Okay.
That's quite a useful little section for
Sure.
making little angle changes, 90 degrees, bends, things like that.
Nice.
And the 2 others would be smaller anvils that have slightly different shaped horns, or even one just being a straight flat block of steel, because it allows you to move around freely. One movement, or should I say aspect of knife making, is your movement around your anvil and how you hold and move your steel, be it with your tongs or whatever instrument you're using. It also adds to how comfortable it is for you when you're standing there hammering away.
Sure. Nice. Well, now that we know all about what a forge can kind of look like and the whole process involved, I noticed outside we're just starting to lose a little bit of light, and I really wanted to get some footage of your forgery and just walk through how you went about making your one in particular. So would you like to go outside and do that?
Yeah, why not? Let's get out there.
Nice.
If you want to check out Nexus's Forge, we're going to upload a video to YouTube and also Instagram, so jump on over and check it out. Thank you for listening to part 2 of our interview with Nexus. If you enjoyed what you heard, please jump over to Knives by Nexus or knivesbynexus.com and give them a follow. You will never regret buying Nexus. It's a product I've used for years at work and will continue to do so. Secondly, if you're one of our regular listeners, could you please go ahead and leave a star rating for us on Spotify, Apple Music, or YouTube? This is the best way you can support us. It draws a heap of attention our way, and it's a way that we can continue to bring you more episodes. Or if you really found the information valuable, then you're welcome to make an offer of a scrumptious cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/betweenviews. In other news, Between Views is always looking for collaborators. If you want to join the team, then please reach out on Instagram. Thanks so much. Finally, if you know someone who deserves to be interviewed or just have some feedback, then send us an email at betweenviewsbv@gmail.com or message us on Instagram. Thanks again and see you soon. Between Views.